I first gave this talk, as Ben said, in 2011. It was a 3.5-hour seminar then. And so I've only got half an hour here. So this is going to be a much abridged version. But I hope you enjoy it. My intention is to make us think about all the tools that we use all the time and really understand what we're looking at and better understand our radios so we can get more out of them. But actually, before I get started, Ben did give me a hard time the other day for registering extremely late for the conference last year. I will say he didn't ask me to do this talk until last week, so so I think he got me back. But in any case, I like to start out with this quote. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so hopefully this talk will help upgrade your models for things. But you know, the real systems are always a little more complicated. And I'm just trying to shed some light on those. So I'm going to start off with, well, it's hard to see much of the flow graph, but it is a relatively, I'll be doing a few relatively simple flow graphs that have noise generators, sine wave generators, filters, and quantization and things like that. Relatively straightforward, and you'll be able to download them. Unfortunately, this seems to be skipping, but in any case, while it's running, I like to start out with this example. So we'll start with looking at FFTs and how do we really interpret them. So let's take this this display here. So we've got a tone in the middle, and we've got a noise floor on our FFT. So what can we tell about this? So first, what's the power of the tone? Anybody? So you can see it goes up to about the -40 line, and actually I hope everybody's able to see this. Some of these will be relatively small, and so we can zoom in, and we can see that it's you know, it's about -39. So is that our power in this signal? And the answer is no. Okay, some of you have seen this before. Good. So how do we determine what our power is when we've got an FFT display? What do these really mean? How do we interpret them? So first, you have to understand what you're looking at. So first, we'll say we'll move the frequency around a little, and you can see. Actually, I'll do a max hold here. That helps view this. And you can see that as we go, the actual power bounces up and down. And let me get a better. Okay, so as we move the signal around, you can see that the blue part, we're only changing the frequency here, but the amplitude is changing. And so what that means is that in this case, by about 3 dB, the amplitude shown on the FFT display will change depending on where your signal is within the bin. And that's known as scalloping loss. So you can't just look at where the peak is to know exactly what power you have. And so there are methods in the sort of spectral estimation world that will take an FFT and tell you exactly where the signal is, even if it's between bins, and how much power is in it. And that's a little more complicated. So if you're just looking at an FFT display to determine you know, power that you've got and signal to noise ratio, you have to make sure that you're interpreting it correctly. So then now I'm going to switch windows. So that was a rectangular window. Let's say we use a Hanning window, which is more common. And now we can see there's a slightly different scalloping loss as we change the the frequency. It's actually a little more, but actually I'm going to let me zoom out here. So okay, so now as we the window, you can see the whole signal change in amplitude. So which is correct? So do we have closer to -40 or do we have closer to -30? And the answer, in this case, it's actually higher than both of them because each window actually has a scaling factor associated with it. Now, in the WX GUI stuff a long time ago, I added the code to scale it for you by the inverse of that loss so that the peak would be the same, but in the Qt GUI stuff, it doesn't have that. So as you change your windows, you get different scaling factors. And so the amount you need to scale it by is the average, the inverse of the average of the amplitude of that window. Because everybody knows these windows look like this, right? If it's rectangular, you don't need to scale it. But if it's got this, you're losing energy in these side pieces. And so that's what you have to scale back out. So now, okay, so now let's convert it back to the rectangular, which was nice. And okay, so now we said that this is lower than the actual value, which you can see here is minus 30. So where's the other energy besides the windowing? And we've converted it to rectangular, so there's no windowing loss. So where's the other energy? Right? Parseval's theorem says we put a certain signal in, the FFT has to give us that total energy out. So where did it all go? And the answer is it's in the side lobes. The other bins, the signal spreads to. But if we can align our signal to exactly be in a bin, then there's none of that. And it all goes into the peak, and you have these perfectly sized, these perfectly centered side lobes. And if it's rectangular, then there's none of that, right? The other windows will spread the amplitude. Even it will cause it to spread even if it's centered, and that's because you're multiplying by a function like this in the time domain, and that's equivalent to a convolution in the frequency domain. Okay, so covered scalloping loss, integer frequency. Okay, so now the next question is, what is the signal to noise ratio of this signal? So we know that this top one is -30. So I'm going to turn up the averaging. So what's our SNR here? Okay, so everybody knows not to answer, I guess, because they're all trick questions. So what you should see is that the top one goes to -30 and the noise is going to -60, and everybody always says, oh, calls that a 30 dB SNR. And actually, the two correct answers are either you haven't given enough information, what bandwidth do you want to talk about the SNR over, or if it's for the whole thing, the answer is actually 0. And the reason is this noise power is spread among many bins. In this case, it's 1,000 bins. So the actual noise power is whatever this average is. Let's say it looks like it's -62 here. It's 30 dB beyond that because it's 1,000 bins is 30 dB. So you have 1,000 bins worth of energy, and that's actually equal to the 30 of the signal there. And when we look at the time domain down here, you can see that the noise amplitude is roughly comparable to the sine wave amplitude there. Okay, so now let's reduce the noise, and actually you can see that here, right? We have -30 for the noise and -30 for the signal, right? Okay, so now what happens in a real radio where we have intermod and things like that? So I'm gonna reduce the noise amplitude here, and actually this is a second signal. And actually, here's a question. Which, this is not a convenient setup. So here the question would be, which of these signals has more energy in it? And of course, the naive answer is that this one does, but the reality is that this actually has more energy in it because you have many, many bins. And so the way to compute that is you say, how many hertz is this? And how many hertz per bin, and then so how many bins wide, and then that's what you would add on or multiply on to the power. So this is actually noise, but it's a good proxy for an OFDM signal. Okay, so now let's take that. Let's turn off that narrowband noise, and let's add a second sine wave. And I'm going to go to more FFT bins here. And okay, so now we have our classic two-tone test that Robin was showing us before, and this is without distortion. So now when we add some distortion, some third-order distortion, we'll see that. We'll see those side lobes pop up. I got to add more power to these. Okay, and you start to see your third-order distortion terms here. Now, why do we have third-order distortion? The reality is that amplifiers are of course, nonlinear. There's nothing inherently third-order about them, but when you look at, when you model the actual nonlinearities, you do it with the Taylor series, and the third-order terms tend to be dominant. There's also fifth order and ninth order, and there's also a seventh order, and there's even order terms, but for the most part, except in certain situations, we mostly care about the odd order, and the third is the most dominant. So if we look at this, we can see how we have these two side tones at the sum and the difference. And if I'd also modeled the fifth order, you would see another set over here and here. So now these are obviously bad because one of these side tones could be blocking your signal of interest, or it could be on it. But on the other hand, what if you say, well, what's the chances that my signal's here, that there's two signals here that are spaced at the proper space to get the intermod where I am? And the reality is that it's actually, if you look at a real system, nobody's sending sine waves, or at least they shouldn't be. But if we have an OFDM signal like that, then its intermod with our signal is not just in one place, but it has width to it. And the reason for that is, again, this is a multiplication in the time domain, and a multiplication in the time domain is a convolution in the frequency domain. So if you have two, you have signals with width in the frequency domain, they will cause other signals to become wider, and they will cause themselves to become wider. And so that's why you get this hump around this OFDM essentially signal, right? It has its width, so that goes here, and this one has its width, and then it's also intermodding with the tones. And so these two strong tones can, the total energy in this signal is causing essentially all of the signals to be multiplied by each other. Okay, so now another way that this can hurt your reception. Let's go down. Just have one strong signal here. I'll turn off the other noise. Okay, so now let's say we have two signals that we're interested in. One is, oops, I'm going to turn off this averaging. So we have two signals, and they're not even necessarily near each other in frequency, but one is significantly weaker than the other. And let's turn our distortion off. Okay, so now let's say I'm looking at this signal, right? And it's at roughly that amplitude. And there's no other signal around, but we're in a nonlinear device, and it's fine. There's our signal. It's a pretty constant amplitude. And now this other signal that's out of the band that we don't really care about shows up, and it won't even show in this display. But by adding it in, the amplitude of this signal actually goes down. And if that other signal happens to be modulated, that modulation will be impressed upon this signal. And so your now what looks like a CW tone will go up and down at the rate that the other signal goes up and down. That's known as blocking. And actually in a lot of radios, it's not a spec that's used much anymore, but there was a spec called blocking dynamic range. And that was essentially saying how small a signal you could see versus how big of a signal that you didn't want to cause 1 dB of loss, 1 dB less gain. So if you got a certain amount of gain with no blocking signal, how high does that blocking signal have to be to cause your gain to drop by a dB? So it's sort of like a P1 dB for receivers. And so you can see, even if there's not this sort of one signal stepping on the other because of these intermods, they can still affect each other if they're in the pass. Strong signals in the passband can affect you. And that's really why AGC is so hard. In AGC, you don't just want to control the gain based on the signal you have. You have to control it based on all of the signals that are showing up to make sure none of them cause bad effects on your receiver, not just your signal. And sometimes that means setting the gain low enough that it hurts the noise floor, the noise figure of the receiver a little bit, just so that you can accommodate those big signals without them messing up the signal that you want to see. So you'd rather have a slightly noisier but clean version of your signal than a distorted one. So, okay, so now we've talked a lot about analog effects of the front end. Let's also look at quantization, right? All of our receivers have A to D converters in them, and most of this applies to D to A converters as well, but we'll talk about it from the A to D perspective. So everybody knows, and actually let me put back to a better thing here. Okay, so this is the scaling is going to kill me. Okay, noise, amplitude. Okay. So now here's our signal that we care about, and we've actually been doing this all with a quantization to 16 bits, which is effectively infinite for our purposes here. What happens as we reduce the quantization to fewer and fewer bits? So this was 16, we go to 12, we go higher. Let's and you start to see, everybody knows that that there's a quantization noise floor that rises, and most of us know that it's 6.02 dB per bit. But the reality is that also you end up with a lot of tones. And quantization noise is not necessarily white noise. Quantization noise, it can be correlated with your signal, especially when there's not enough background noise. So you notice as I add more background noise here, it can clean up some of those tones. And so that's called dither, and in audio that's very important. Very often in RF, we actually have enough natural noise coming in because we have a wide enough bandwidth and enough amplification in front of it that there's often dither already. So you don't necessarily have to worry about it at the same level as you would in an audio A to D converter, let's say. But here we're looking at a 5-bit converter, and that gives us a certain signal to noise ratio, signal to quantization noise ratio. Now, I very often would have people, when I was selling USRPs, they would say, "Oh, how much gain does this have?" And I'd say, "Well, it has the 60 dB or whatever the gain is." And very often I would get the answer that, "Well, that's not enough gain for my signal." And I would say, well, why is that not enough gain? And the answer was invariably, well, I need enough gain so that my signal that I need to receive at minus X dB will be at least 1 bit in the A to D converter. And that's actually, it sounds like, it makes sense, but in actuality, that doesn't really matter. And so you can receive signals that are far lower than one bit of A to D range, and I'll show you that here. So I'm gonna turn down all of the noise here first. So we have no noise, we just have signal. So here's a signal at 16 dB quantization. You get this nice clean signal, and we progressively reduce it. And actually, let me put this back to, there we go. So at 8 bits, it's kind of starting to get ugly. 12, 16, it's good. 10, 8. And actually, if we look at it down here, unfortunately, this is cut off, and I can't really rescale it. We see both the signal and the noise. Let me change the frequency so it's a little higher. And so you can see there's quantization noise, significant quantization happening because the signal is very weak compared to what the level of the quantizer is. And actually, if we drop it to one less quantizer bit, it's not even hitting one level on the A to D. And so that's what these users were concerned with, that their signal would not hit one level on the A to D. But the reality is that in a real radio, you're going to have noise. And so by having noise there, the noise is enough to get you flipping bits in the A to D. And then your signal, which is weak and very often significantly weaker than 1 bit on the A to D, will still be registered through averaging over many, many samples. So obviously the oversampling here helps. But so here we can see there's the signal, and without the noise it's here. Let's. Okay, so right, nothing there because of the because you're not hitting you're not tripping the bits of the A to D, but you add some noise in and it starts tripping it, and you can actually see the signal there. And I'll go back to the bigger FFT. So here you can see the signal. Now, obviously it's a low signal to noise ratio, but it's usable and you can see it. Now, so what can you do? You can, if there's not enough noise, then you can use, you can add noise, and that's called dithering. And actually, in radio astronomy, at least in the old days, used to use 1-bit, 2-bit, 4-bit A to D converters. Even though you would think that that would be terrible, well, how would you receive all these really weak signals? But the reality is there was enough noise that they're always triggering those bits, and when you average it out, it comes through as a clean signal. But let's say you don't want to add this noise. I want a cleaner signal there. So let's actually add some narrowband noise. Right? We can add the narrowband noise, and I'll take away the wideband noise. And it's still triggering the bit, but now that's actually made the signal worse. But what if I move that narrowband noise away from my signal of interest? So now I haven't added noise on top of my signal. I've added noise somewhere else, but it's enabled my A to D to function. And I can see my signal with actually quite a good signal to noise ratio now. So how did we do that? The noise will trigger the bits of the A to D even if it's not on the frequency that you currently care about. So you can then filter it out, which is what the FFT does. And this is actually the principle behind sigma delta A to D converters, which is add noise somewhere you don't care about it and then filter it away later digitally. And that's how you can have a 1-bit A to D converter for audio and still have incredible 100+ dB dynamic range and very good signal to noise ratios. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I don't know how I am on time. Only a couple minutes, okay. Okay, so now let's do, this is we'll move on to digital signals. So here I have a QAM16 signal, and what does it look like when you actually pass it through a real radio? If you add noise, everybody will guess that the points become circles of, and this is standard Gaussian noise. And obviously the more that is, the harder it is to decode this signal. But what happens if we add distortion, like third order distortion? So if we remember that third order distortion is really about gain dropping as the signal gets bigger. So as you drop the gain, it actually pushes the outer constellation points inward and forms this circle. And so the inner points are affected less. And so this is what third order distortion looks like. And actually in a real amplifier you would see this. You would probably also see some, this was called AM to AM, or amplitude modulation to amplitude modulation. You'd also see some AM to PM, which is amplitude modulation to phase modulation, which would cause the outer ring to also rotate relative to the inner ring. And so those are things that in a transmitter you would want to compensate for using digital predistortion or something like that. But on a receiver, you want to make sure that you don't have so much gain that you're running into that situation. Now, if we follow this a little further, we see that the outer points actually start to go back out. Now, why is that? That's because I've modeled this as third order, but you would never be operating at this point. And this is where your model breaks down, right? At this point, you would see 5th order, 7th order, 9th order, and everything would have collapsed down. So again, you have to know how far you can take your model and not read too much into it. But this is an accurate down to about that point of what it would look like. Now, if we take that off and we just look at plain old clipping, clipping will do more like what you expect. It'll pull everything in. And that's actually a more accurate model for the extreme compression. So this is where, like, if this was BPSK, it really wouldn't affect the signal. If this was FSK, it wouldn't affect the signal at all. And in fact, you would really want to clip. But for linear modulations like QAM and the like, you don't want to be operating in that regime. Now, there's another impairment that radios see, and that's phase noise. So let's add some phase noise to this. First of all, what does anybody think this would look like with phase noise? Yes, so gentleman in the front says it would look like it's rotated, and it does. So that's what phase noise looks like on a QAM constellation. So now let's look at this all for OFDM. So now we do the same thing for OFDM, and okay, it still looks like this is a QAM16, but OFDM modulated. Now, so what does noise do to this signal? Well, let's see. Well, it basically does the same thing that we'd expect. But how does distortion affect the signal? Any ideas? No? Anybody who was here 8 years ago? So as you add distortion to an OFDM signal, you don't get the clumping. And it's actually the same with the clipping. Even if you add just the clipping, what does it do? Oh, it actually doesn't reduce the amplitude of any individual bin. It just adds noise. So why is that? Well, what's happening is that when the signal is in the time domain, you have many, many separate QAM signals added to each other, and it looks like a noise-like signal. And you have these big excursions in amplitude. Well, if you clip or you have distortion, it's like adding, when you have a big excursion high, it's like having a big impulse pushing negative that's removing that. So what happens when you add a big impulse? Wideband noise, and that's what you're seeing. And so a lot of distortions on OFDM that would have characteristic appearances with a single carrier modulation will just look like noise on OFDM. And for that reason, OFDM receivers are often characterized in terms of what they call error vector magnitude, which is sort of a catch-all that covers the AWGN and the distortion and the interference and all the other products that are in there, because they all look like Gaussian noise anyway. And so you just characterize it as this basically a noise-like impairment. So now phase noise should also make the constellation rotate, right? When we add phase noise, once again, it looks like Gaussian noise. So why is that? Well, it's individually making each of those constellations actually rotate a little, but more dominant is when you multiply by phase noise, which is no longer a sine wave, it now has skirts in the frequency domain. When you multiply in the time domain, you convolve in the frequency domain, and so each of your individual signals will then, instead of being a spike, will now have skirts. And when you look at the ones next to it, every guy next to him, he's interfering with it. And so what you're seeing is noise from your fellow other constellations being modulated onto your signal. And so again, it looks like Gaussian noise. Again, it's included in the EVM. The same thing goes for IQ imbalance. IQ imbalance also ends up looking like noise because you're folding another frequency onto your current frequency, but that other frequency has a random signal that you don't know what it is, and so it's being added to yours. So even though you might see a crooked constellation in a single carrier, again, it becomes noise. So EVM on an OFDM signal captures all of the transmitter impairments, or all of the radio impairments, all in one place, and gives you one single way of looking at it. So when you have an OFDM signal, it's hard to diagnose what's going on in your transceiver because a lot of it's hidden by that fact. With single carrier, it's easier. If the constellation is crooked, well, that's I've got IQ imbalance. If it's crunched, that's distortion. But with OFDM, it's much harder. So let's see. I think that's what I've got. So if anybody has any questions, let me know, and hopefully I'll get to do the full 4-hour version someday. Again, I got to really train for that in advance. It's kind of a marathon, but I've enjoyed giving that talk. So
thank you, Matt.
Thank you.